Hello, it is July the 4th, 2024. I'm Brian McCall, and I'm joined by my co-host Murray Rundis for the Catholic Family News Weekly News Roundup, where once a week we review several stories that have emerged in the past week in the church and throughout the wider world and give you a traditional Catholic perspective on them. Today is obviously the beginning of the war that's had America established as a country when independence was first proclaimed in Philadelphia. On the church's calendar, it is a feria, although there is, as with really any day, even when there's a feria, there are still martyrs and saints that are associated with that day and can be commemorated. But before we get into that, we'll let you know our stories for this week. Breaking news: the Times of London published a short but potent appeal to Pope Francis not to suppress the Latin Mass. And we're going to tell you a little bit about what they said and the names that were associated with it. We have finally left Pride Month, the month that celebrates the root of all sin, the capital sin, and we'll give you kind of a roundup of what happened with that this year. The Supreme Court issued its last decision for this term, and it ruled on presidential immunity. We'll tell you what that means for President Donald Trump and his various legal woes. And then finally, we're going to return to a story we've talked about before, but in light of other things going on, we thought it was really good to give a recap of the Father Rupnik scandal and what's been happening with that. While the Vatican's busy prosecuting Archbishop Vigano, we'll let you know what doesn't really merit punishment in today's Vatican. So those are our stories for this week, plus a short note at the end about bishops for the Society of St. Pius X, a little announcement about that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the saint that could be, according to the permissions of the missal, commemorated by priests today?
Yeah, so today is Saint Andrew of Crete. And now this is a saint that is more well known in the East, but in the West he is still recognized. And Saint Andrew of Crete was a wonderful preacher, but he was most importantly an amazing composer of whether it be liturgical texts, things like hymns, but also homilies as well, because he was such a great preacher. And what I want to recommend is this little book right here. It's called On the Dormition of Mary, Early Patristic Homilies. That's translated with an introduction by Father Daly, who's a Jesuit. We'll be talking a lot about Jesuits today. He seems to be one of the better Jesuits. And what those homilies are so important, and they contain many of St. Andrew of Crete's homilies, is it shows an early patristic testimony of the Immaculate Conception, and even there's hints of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin as well in the Catholic understanding. And the reason why that's so important, especially in today's age, is there's a worrying trend among the Eastern Orthodox communion and the various theologians on that side that has decided ever since the schism to just say everything that Rome says is false, whether it have early patristic evidence or not. And one of those things that has gone by the wayside is the Immaculate Conception. Because this is something that Rome said, many Eastern Orthodox will deem, well, this is something that needs to be dismissed. When in reality, the Immaculate Conception, you can find the early stages of it there in the patristic homilies, especially those Dormition homilies. So those are a very good read if you want to not only hear the great fruit the fathers have to say, but also see a great testimony to the Immaculate Conception.
Very true. It's very true. And there's actually two other saints very much associated with the East who are coming up: Saint Cyril and Methodius as well, who are really the apostles to the East. So, to our Eastern Catholic, Uniate Catholics in the East, we wish you sort of great happiness for these feasts. Next week coming up, Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, who's another one of these great royal saints, such as Margaret of Scotland, as another example, but also Saint Elizabeth is related to another great noble saint, Elizabeth of Hungary. She was actually her niece, and she was named after her. And Elizabeth of Hungary is the one who's famous for the Miracle of the Roses. But Elizabeth of Portugal, originally of Aragon in Spain, married into the Portuguese royal family and lived out her state in life beautifully, and upheld those, and was held up to the church for her by the church for her heroic virtue. Also coming up, which will be next week, is the feast of St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More, the Chancellor of England, and he was martyred for his refusal to bend both to the marriage, the illicit and invalid marriage that Henry proclaimed for himself, that began the great schism and then heresy in England, but also would not bend to the act of supremacy declaring the king the supreme head of the church in England. And recall, all of the bishops of England but one endorsed Henry's proclamation, went along with it. Friend of St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, was the one, and his famous words, which could have applied to the bishops at Vatican II: the fort has been betrayed by those who should have defended it. And the two of them communicated a bit when they were in the tower together. And if you're interested in learning more about St. Thomas More, Angelico Press, who is sponsoring this program today, thank you for contributing to make this program possible, has republished a really good biography of St. Thomas More by R.W. Chambers. And this was written in the early 20th century. It was awarded the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 1935. It's really a wonderful account. There are several good biographies of him. I actually like this one because it really gives you, I think, the most well-rounded view of the saint, and it integrates some discussion of his writings and not just the events of his life. So it's about one of the, I like several, but this one I really do recommend. And since we are in partnership with Angelico, thanking them for sponsoring this, we will have a link that will be a direct link to this book where you can get free shipping, as well as have some of the proceeds get donated to Catholic Family News. If you don't find the link or can't find it, if when you check out, you type Catholic Family News, one word, in the promotion box, you will get the same result. So the direct link will bring you there. You don't need a promo code, but you can use Catholic Family News if you go through just the regular website. And thank you again to Angelico Press. Well, let's move on to our first story. And for that, we are going to talk about a letter that was published by the Times of London earlier this week related to the traditional Latin Mass. And its opening line referred to a similar appeal by English celebrities to Pope Paul VI in 1971. And the story, if it's apocryphal or not, I'm not sure, but it's been handed down for decades now. When the letter was published, pleading with Pope Paul VI to allow some amount of the Latin Mass to survive, he was looking down and he stopped at the name Agatha Christie and said, "Ooh, Agatha Christie, I like her writing. Yes, I'll grant an indult." Now, I don't know exactly if that's how it happened, but he certainly did see the letter, and he did grant to England, the first place to have an indult, to not that an indult was needed, as Pope Benedict has told us that the Mass was never uh, and could never be abrogated, but he did make provision for that. So this group, which really is a pretty stellar list, I mean, almost every other name is Lord so and so. There's Lord Bailey of Paddington, Lord Alton of Liverpool, Lord Bamford, Lord Berkeley of on and on and on. Princess Michael of Kent, who is, I forget now after Elizabeth died, but she was somewhere like eighth or ninth in line to the throne of England. They're also among those eminent people signing it is Tristram Hunt, who's the director of the Great V&A in London, Sir Nicholas Coleridge, who is the chairman of Historical Royal Palaces, Lord Stirrup, the former chief of the defense staff, and quite a few people from The musical world also, um, Kiri Te Kanawa, Andras Schiff, also the great pianist Ushida, Mitsuko Ushida, as well as Andrew and Julian Lloyd Webber. So we were debating before we could call it the Phantom of the Opera indult or the Jesus Christ Superstar indult. Perhaps Pope Francis will see Andrew Lloyd Webber, and that will influence him. I don't know, but really quite a long list, and many of them, as you can imagine from that name, those names are not Catholic. They describe their letter as ecumenical. Maybe the one time that word's not giving me the EBGBs, but ecumenical, because there are certainly Catholics among them, but a lot of non-Catholics, some people who even are self-proclaimed atheists, but who see, if not the theological value, at least the cultural and aesthetic value of the traditional Latin Mass. And in fact, there was an article that was published along the same time as as the letter to the editor by the composer Sir James Macmillan. And he says in that the Latin Mass is a, quote, jewel that must be treasured. And he deplores, these are his words, although I couldn't have said it better, petty Philistine authoritarianism of those in the Vatican. So let me just show you very briefly the short letter. Take a little look at what the letter says. I think this is it here. Yeah. So, Latin Mass at risk. Sir, because they're writing into the Times, on July 6, 1971, the Times printed an appeal to Pope Paul VI in defense of the Latin Mass, signed by Catholic, non-Catholic artists, writers, including Agatha Christie, Graham Greene, who was Catholic, Udi Menuhin, I think also Mudgeridge signed it, if I remember right. This became known as the Agatha Christie letter because it was reportedly her name that prompted the Pope to issue an indult or permission for celebration of the Latin Mass in England and Wales. Pause for a moment. As I said, really, this indult we now know was never needed. There was a um, group of 9 cardinals called by John Paul II in 1983 to decide was the Latin Mass actually abrogated. 8 of the 9 voted that it wasn't, and no indult was necessary. And Pope Benedict XVI, when he issued Summorum Pontificum, referred to the traditional Latin Mass, which he called the Missal of John the 23rd, which had never been abrogated and was always in theory permitted. But still, at the time, people didn't quite understand that and asked for permission. Going back to this letter, the letter argued that the rite in question, in its magnificent Latin text, has inspired priceless achievements by poets, philosophers, musicians, architects, painters, and sculptors in all countries and epochs. Thus, it belongs to universal culture. And this was really a strong point in 1971 that the church, as the guardian of this great treasure, not just theologically and spiritually, but it was really a guardian of treasures that belong to Western culture. It really, in reading it, I remember the first time I read that indult, they're really saying this would be like if the church went in with a sledgehammer to destroy the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That the church cannot do that because the church, even though having possession of it, it has to hold it in trust really for everyone, such a great, and that's only a mere artistic treasure, not just the Mass. So they go on to say, as we have reported here, that there are reports from Rome that the Latin Mass is to be banished from nearly every Catholic church. And as we said, I think that seems very likely. There's been no contradiction of these reports that that's what's in the cards. They say this is a painful and confusing prospect, especially for the growing number of young Catholics whose faith has been nurtured by it. Again, interesting. Even these non-Catholics notice this, that it is attracting young people. The traditional liturgy is a cathedral of text and gesture. It's really a beautiful way to express it. Developing as those venerable buildings did over many centuries. Not everyone appreciates its value, and that is fine. Okay, I may take issue with that. But to destroy it seems an unnecessary and insensitive act in a world where history can all too easily slip away forgotten. The old rite's ability to encourage silence and contemplation is a treasure not easily replicated, and when gone, impossible to reconstruct. This appeal, like its predecessor, is entirely ecumenical. Again, they go on and on and on about how it's ecumenical. See, with a hope that you will reconsider any further restrictions of access to this magnificent spiritual and cultural heritage. And you can see all the names there for yourself. So, really, a startling appeal. I mean, something that seemed possible in 1971, but with the continued degeneration of the world, I have to say this caught me off guard. I really didn't think the establishment celebrities would really have it in them to defend this mass anymore, which gets labeled anti-Semitic and all other sort of unfair names. But they did, and really they're referring to the Philistine authoritarianism of Pope Francis for things that are just essentially necessary and cruel. Really couldn't say it any better. But sadly, this Pope does seem to be bent on the auto demolition of the church. He really seems to have taken von Balthasar, that modernists uh, urging to destroy the bastions to heart, and does seem bent on really smashing, obliterating this great cathedral, which, as they say, being built over millennia, cannot just be sort of rebuilt that easily. So we'll see. The cynic in me says Francis will not be touched by this. I do find ironic there are so many English signatories, again, not all, but many English signatories. And I think the real hatchet man behind this, I mean, Francis is certainly happy to do it, but I think it's Cardinal Arthur Roche, the little English roach that crawled out of England to Rome, that is really pushing for this. He has hated the traditional Mass for decades when he was an ordinary back in England. And so I find it interesting that his own country's establishment is really rebuking what must be going on. But we can hope. I mean, Francis is clearly very enamored with the celebrities, the people of this world. So, it is possible this could get his attention and maybe moderate to some extent what was about to happen. It's possible.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You mentioned it is a surprise. I was especially surprised Lloyd Webber was on there. Like, I mean, his art is oftentimes just antithetical to what the
Ah,
Latin Mass
yeah,
promotes. That's actually how I got my start in the entertainment business, was being in his musicals, and they're oftentimes completely degenerate things like
yeah,
Jesus Christ Superstar. Not a good thing to go see. However, there are some very esteemed people on there as well, as Brian mentioned. People who are at least opening their hearts up to the truth. And I think there's something that we can identify here. And if you've been to a classical music concert where they perform a piece from the Holy Mass, oftentimes you'll see, for example, Mozart's Requiem, or different pieces from Palestrina, or the Mass in B minor that Bach produced. All of these things, they typically they'll give you a little handout describing the great text that is the Mass, and they'll describe it as an artistic work. And from when it comes to religious art, non-secular art, the traditional Latin Mass is as good as you can get. It's the highest form of art, and anybody that's inclined towards the arts is going to recognize that. Now, I think there's two things to recognize. Firstly, it's that the importance of having aesthetics and having things that lift our hearts up to God, especially when we have things like Gregorian chant and the and polyphony and the beautiful even gestures and texts within the traditional Latin Mass. All of these things are purified forms of art that help us give ourselves to God. And that's really what we need to get back to. But there's also something I think we should be cautious of, which is we've seen this in the past 2 years. I mentioned this about Mass of the Ages, my concerns about that, which is this idea that the traditional Latin Mass could be suppressed. that it
Mhm.
could be abrogated. People have to be very cautious about that. When we say that the traditional Latin Mass can't go away, that's not based on nothing. We actually there's That's a very substantial claim we're making. For one, it's an argument from authority based on quo primum that's supported by Summorum Pontificum with Benedict XVI, but it's also just looking at capital T tradition. Every time you look at the different documents on the liturgy within the Council of Trent, or even if you look at the different coronation oaths that the popes have had to take traditionally, they talk about the received and approved rites. Now, what that implies is that they've received something, that they didn't just manufacture something in the 1960s, making up different Eucharistic prayers in Italian cafes on napkins. That's not a received rite. It might be approved, but it's not received. So when we say that the traditional Latin Mass and the various traditional rites, like the Dominican rite, are received and approved rites, they can't be taken away from us because they're a part of that capital T tradition. So that's something we have to keep in mind. We can't be in the mindset of a defeatist mindset or a positivist mindset where the Pope can just take everything away from us. We are basing our opinions on tradition, on doctrine, and on the teaching of Jesus Christ. So that's something I would just be cautious of. But in general, I completely agree with you. Great names on that list and a good thing to see in general.
Yes, I just want to follow up on one thing you said about the connection between when they perform these Mozart or different masses and music. Is a reminder the Novus Ordo cannot produce these great musical works. It's
Mhm.
incompatible with them. And this really was struck me most when I saw I think it was St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. They performed Mozart's Requiem Mass and had actually John Paul II come and say a Novus Ordo Mass while they were trying to integrate it. So we're going to put the music back into its context that it was written for, they claimed. Well, it actually looked ridiculous because I'll just take, a couple of examples. During the Kyrie, uh, there was like nothing to do, or the Sanctus. So the Sanctus is an even better example. The Sanctus would start, the first half of the canon would get said by the priest. They'd reach the end of the first part of the Sanctus, the consecration would occur, and then the Benedictus would be sung post consecration. So during this long musical performance, the priest would be doing things. Well, here they would start the Sanctus, and because of the way the Novus Ordo is, John Paul II would just sort of stand there looking around, like twiddling his thumbs, rather lengthy because it's a rather lengthy piece. Like, what do I do? There's nothing to do because the music was written to fill in and be there in the background while the liturgical actions were being performed, the incensing of the altar or the canon. And it really struck me when I watched that, because he really just looked like this statue standing there, like, hurry up and finish so I can get back to doing it. Their whole plan of integrating the music back into its setting when they did it in a Novus Ordo really just fell on its face. And
Mhm.
that is why, even though now it's been, you maybe they could argue for the first 10 years, 20 years, well, the Novus Ordo will produce great art. It just needs time. Well, now, it's half a century old, and it's not produced anything greater than On Eagle's Wings or Here I Am, Lord. And there are some of the better ones. So it is really true I think these artistic people, these people from art, have enough to see that there's something about this mass that is intricately connected to it. And as we've said, that is not the sole reason. That's not the reason you should be willing to be unjustly punished for the aesthetics of the mass, for the artistic element of it. Ultimately, it's a theological argument and a theological uh, martyrdom for the mass, but that doesn't mean that its aesthetic value is of insignificance. We are creatures of body and soul, and the liturgy is meant to speak to our body as well as our soul, to draw people in. I've known many people who found the music, the liturgy, the gestures first, and knew no theology, were drawn in for that, and then found the theology. Some the other way, read their way to the mass and then learn to appreciate it. But for some people, these external ceremonies are a gateway into the doctrine and into the truth. So we'll see what happens. Maybe in the next couple weeks, we're going to have a show where, there will be something coming out of the Vatican, and we'll see if this letter had any effect on that.
Hopefully it does. Goodness
Yes,
gracious.
hopefully. Well, speaking of goodness gracious, we are finally out of the month of the capital sin.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that are just completely shameful about this. The first is regarding just Pride Month in general. Um, Now, I've mentioned before there did seem to be some added resistance this time around. For whatever reason, I think just the different conservative boycotts might have worked in the past. Corporations might have been a bit more scared this time around. But in general, we saw the same kind of degeneracy on display, whether that be people in the nude doing terrible acts on the street, police officers letting them do whatever they want because they're worried about seeming homophobic, all kinds of things. But the real sad thing that goes along with all of this is that it has thoroughly infiltrated the Catholic Church. And in the time where we're saying that Archbishop Vigano is a schismatic and we're doing everything we can to suppress the traditional Latin Mass, there maintains this steady movement within the church to try to get these vices normalized. And one of the best examples of this happened at the end of so-called Pride Month at the end of June, where once again our good friend Father James Martin was a part of a LGBTQ Catholics event. They were what the organizers were the Imago Dei conference. Now I want to show just a few of the pictures involved of this. Firstly, here is Father Martin speaking at this. What do we see in the very front? Well, we see some sort of woman wearing some sort of religious garb. And of course, she's surrounded with the LGBTQ flag. She's holding up the LGBTQ flag as well. And again, just this alone, the scandal involved, a a man that is in the higher ups that you can get when it comes to being a Catholic priest. He has open conversations with Pope Francis. He had his ministry endorsed practically every Pride month that rolls around. Yet he comes out here obviously embracing the LGBTQ agenda. Now, there's other pictures as well. You might notice a familiar face that we talked about right here. This is a hermit that we've talked about before. The woman who really concealed the fact that she was a transgender, pretending to be a man hermit, endorsed by her bishop, Bishop Stowe, I believe it was. And here we see this conference. Something to note is that it doesn't seem all that active. It's because I think most people can clearly discern that Catholicism is completely at odds with this religion. They can just go to the Episcopalian Church and they will find the aesthetics, people obsessed with the aesthetics, but they'll have sodomy openly promoted. So that's another reason why we cannot promote aesthetics alone. However, there is even more when it comes to this. This is something we've seen mass scandal with. Not only do we see the Father Martin there without a clerical collar holding up the shirt, but we see other shirts like the Blessed Mother in wearing blasphemously this LGBTQ robe. We keep seeing images like this, and this especially this year, it was totally in your face. And much of that has to do with Fiducia Supplicans, where we can debate whether or not the couple or the union is being blessed all we want. But there was a clear symbol given to the LGBTQ Catholic community. Go ahead. At least that's what it's interpreted as. Many dioceses do not do enough to suppress this kind of movement. There are other stories. For example, at the holy site for the LGBTQ movement is this Stonewall location. Unfortunately, this location, there was an open Pride Mass that was celebrated there in memorial for that. We also saw in New Jersey, there was, thank goodness we had Catholics that went out there protesting this, that were upset about this, but the St. Joseph Parish Maplewood proudly presented the parish family Pride Mass. So this is the kind of stuff that's just gotten completely open within the Catholic Church. I think the thing to take home is to realize that they're trying to demoralize us. They're trying to make it seem like all of our churches, everywhere we go, they have conquered it. They have their own flag, they have their own banner, that they occupy different spaces. If Catholics do not make the bold decision to also occupy these spaces in protest of these terrible, blasphemous things that are coming out of this demonic movement, we're not going to go anywhere. They're the ones that are occupying things. They're the ones planting their flags. It's time for Catholics to start standing up against these things. And most importantly, the hierarchy, making sure that a priest can't be roaming around doing these scandalous things while your everyday conservative priest who tries everything he can to follow the Catholic faith gets suppressed, moved to a different place because he celebrates the traditional Latin Mass. Not a good look for many of these dioceses, and especially not a good look for the Jesuits in this point in time.
And that priest referred doesn't even have to offer the traditional Latin Mass. He might just preach a sermon about the errors of practicing the sin of sodomy, or as Father Michael Rodriguez in Texas, go to a city council meeting to speak out against a law encouraging this kind of sinful behavior, and then get banished to the outer reaches of the diocese. Fortunately for him, he found the traditional Latin Mass there, where he was banished, and was so God brought good out of even that punishment. But you're right. To me, this really points out the utter hypocrisy of what's going on. Again, whatever you think of Archbishop Vigano, whatever disagreements you might have, that the Vatican is putting all this effort into putting him on trial and punishing him, while Father James Martin is written letters of congratulation while he goes along, clearly showing himself not in full communion with the Catholic faith, because to be in full communion, you have to believe all the truths which the Catholic Church teaches, including the Ten Commandments. So it really just highlights the hypocrisy of what's going on in the conciliar church.
For sure. And I'll completely agree there that no matter what disagreements and different little particular things we can pull up with Archbishop Vigano's letter and his different concerns, and those might be real disagreements, but at the end of the day, he's going to always win from an optics point of view,
Yeah.
because he can always say, I'm just following what every Catholic priest was doing before the Second Vatican Council. Father Martin, what he's doing would be condemned in any age of the Catholic Church, which is seemingly promoting this sin, promoting this community that is revolved around sin. If that's what full communion looks like, that it's something that's unbelievable. We that cannot be what full communion is. We have to get back to the traditional faith. And I will also say, this is the sense in which you'll hear traditional priests say you have to separate yourself from the conciliar church. I don't think that necessarily means saying we're not going to visit with people that are in the Novus Ordo. That doesn't mean that you can't go to a traditional mass that has Pope Francis's name named in the canon, but we have to separate ourselves from this. Every time it gets away from the traditional Catholic faith, we have to separate ourselves from it because it corrupts our souls.
Absolutely. Well, we're at least in the month of the most precious blood, and we are therefore praying in the spirit of reparation, the spirit of redemption. So may the precious blood of our Lord wash away all of this corruption.
Mhm.
So, speaking of corruption, the Trump indictments from the Ministry of Justice in the Orwellian state of Biden was dealt a bit of a blow by the Supreme Court at their final announced opinions this week. So the case they considered comes out of one of the attempted prosecutions of President Trump, brought in the DC Circuit. Trump raised in the trial court before they started the trial a defense of immunity, that the president has immunity for the acts you claim that are criminal, and therefore whether you can prove this or not is irrelevant. The trial can't go on. The trial court, really, without really allowing any time for argument, immediately said no. He took an interlocutory appeal to the Court of Appeals of the DC Circuit. They quickly dispensed with it, said no, went up to the Supreme Court. They heard oral argument and today issued what's being put out as a 6-3 opinion, with the three dissenters being the three whiny women. Sotomayor, Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. But it really is a 5-4 in many ways because the Amy Coney Barrett, who's getting about as you know unreliable as a rainstorm in the desert. Really, although she claims it with the majority, undercuts it by not joining the full opinion and agrees, basically says Trump should be immediately convicted and punished for what he's done. And yeah, it's just bizarre. But in any event, a victory, a 5-4, 6-3 doesn't really matter at the end of the day. What did they decide? So they decided, first of all, as a clear statement that the president, whoever it is, not just Donald Trump, but any president, has immunity for any of the core constitutional acts, any core exercise of his constitutional authority, that you cannot be, as has been decided previously by prior Supreme Courts, be sued civilly for damages, nor now they say charged and prosecuted criminally. They then go on to say that there is a presumption of immunity when you sort of get beyond that, beyond those sort of core duties of the president, constitutional duties, to the periphery of his office. He still has immunity, it's presumed, but the prosecutor might be able to rebut that presumption by showing that prosecuting the some acts that are in the periphery would not damage the independence of the executive. They also went on to rule, and this will become important, we explain what it means, that the acts of the president which are immune from prosecution also must be excluded as evidence. So you can't even bring them in and talk about them in a trial for an actual crime. So what could someone as president be prosecuted for? What they say is for acting outside of the scope of his office, acting in a merely private way, nothing to do with being president. So, for example, I mean, I don't know if he'd do this, but I mean, the current president is maybe so not with it that he might do it. He's wandering down and wanders into a store and steals from the store, right? While he happens to be in the store. He takes up a bunch of stuff and walks out with it. Okay. Or he murders his wife one day, right? Nothing to do with being president. He obviously could be prosecuted for those things, although you could not bring into that case as evidence of those crimes things he was doing in his official capacity. Now, why does the majority say this must be the case? It's really a matter of just logic and common sense that if the president could be brought up on criminal charges for making executive decisions, exercising his office, that would be a restraint on the president to sort of do what has to get done. Why? Think about it. We're such a litigious culture. Okay, a decision has to get made. All right, let's bring in a bunch of lawyers. What's the risk that I'm going to get brought up on charges? Again, the importance is even if you get acquitted, seeing it happen to Trump, it could destroy your life in terms of, Trump has more money, but if you don't have that much money, if you have not either Trump been wealthy before or like Obama or Biden have no money but go into government service and become millionaires somehow, wonder how, you're not going to be able to survive a massive prosecution. And so the idea is when you're exercising your office, you have to think about, I might have to defend myself criminally. It's going to basically make you so conservative, so afraid to do anything that you'll paralyze the president. So that's their logic. The dissent went kind of crazy and basically said it, is this dystopian nightmare has been unleashed on the country. Really arguing as the majority opinion says, from pure emotion, not from reality. They say, oh, this means the president could murder his political rival or he could take a bribe. Well, obviously not, because those things are outside the scope of his office. So murdering, someone is outside the scope of his office. The kind of hyperbolic scare tactics really are a bit crazy. In any event, what does it now mean? Well, the court here, I think, didn't go as far as they could have. They said, well, there's two things we can say. All of the charges in this ongoing case that produced this appeal that relate to the President Trump's conversations with the acting attorney general and the Justice Department about investigating or looking into election fraud in the 2020 election are part of his job as president. Is part of his job to execute the laws. He has an obligation to ensure that elections comply with the law. And having conversations with the Justice Department about, I think there may have been shady activity here, this should be investigated, you should do that, is part of his executive function to direct the Justice Department. Secondly, any conversations that he's alleged to have had with his vice president about the vice president's performing his constitutional duty to count and accept the electoral votes are part of his job as president, as the supervisor of the vice president, and those cannot be brought up. They're at the core of Jack Smith's phony indictment. So they basically say those charges are thrown out. But then they chicken out, I think, and they basically say, as to the rest of what might be left, we don't know. We can't tell. We have to send it back to this corrupt judge in the District of Columbia, and you need to figure out, are the other things, for example, Trump giving a speech on January 6th, part of his office or not, and whether he's immune or not. They set out some principles that seem to make it pretty clear they're not, but they don't really go the whole route and say this whole case should be thrown out. So really, really strong uh, opinion. Doesn't go quite that far to end the whole case, but much of the case has been gutted. It also affects other cases. So the Georgia case, although a state case, is still based on presidential acts. They've charged Trump and others, quote, with conspiracy to commit election fraud, which is kind of irony of ironies, since he was trying to stop election fraud. But in any event, that case in Georgia is also, I think, subject to challenge under presidential immunity under this opinion. And the case in New York, which I have to say, I didn't quite connect these dots until I saw it. That's the case where they're charging Trump with, while he was president, having his Trump organization record fees paid to his lawyer to reimburse his lawyer for a legal payment as legal fees as being misleading. Right? Remember, that's the Bragg case where they say he mislabeled his books for his pays to his lawyer. Interestingly, they have now filed a motion in that case. If you recall, he was found, quote, guilty by a rigged jury in New York, but he's now filed a motion that should be thrown out because those events occurred when he was president and the conversations occurred uh, with, and there was testimony from his secretary in the White House, and that those would also, not that the crime itself from which he's accused to be immune, but the evidence that was brought in were things related to him being president that could not be brought in, and therefore the evidence was tainted and could not be used in the trial. Interestingly, the judge has had an in for Trump from the beginning, just a Trump, derangement syndrome sufferer, uh, immediately canceled Trump's sentencing July 11th and said, it is rescheduled after you give me the arguments on why the trial now fails, for September 18th if it becomes necessary. And that if necessary suggests he realized the game's up and this case may be out the window. As well as, interestingly, Justice Thomas, who I think is one of the greatest jurists on the Supreme Court, he wrote a concurring opinion. It's sort of, I agree, and I want to give you some extra reasons. But he also said, for another reason, this whole thing is tainted. This prosecutor, Jack Smith, is not actually a prosecutor and is in a legal office. He was not appointed constitutionally. Why that's important is he's got two cases. He has another case in Florida that's going on. And right now, Judge Cannon in that case in Florida is deciding this very issue. So Justice Clarence Thomas actually gave her a roadmap of why that is illegal. To explain it very briefly, under European law for centuries, they actually had private prosecution. So private citizens could go in and prosecute you for a crime. And it led to a lot of corruption. So the English system and American system basically said it's not good for private citizens to go around prosecuting people. We need to have official procedures to appoint public people who are answerable to the government to take on this power. And so under the Constitution, only U.S. attorneys who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate can have the power to prosecute. Well, Jack Smith was not a U.S. attorney. In the past, a lot of people are confused by this. In the past, when there have been special prosecutors appointed, they were already U.S. attorneys. This guy was just a private citizen. And Biden just said, hey, we're going to just have you go prosecute Trump. No Senate confirmation, which really means the powers he's been exercising are really illegal. And this is what essentially summarizing, paraphrasing what Justice Thomas said, sort of go on further about why this case is just such a sham. So I think it was a very positive day for Trump. It may throw out that guilty conviction in New York. It may end all the other cases in D.C., Florida, and Georgia as a result. And it really does show you, who is who. Barrett essentially went on about how Trump should be quickly prosecuted. And where she really took issue is she says, even if he's immune, all the stuff should be able to come into court, which undermines the whole protection of the immunity. She also has been really bad votes on a case we talked about before, the Missouri v. Biden one on the censorship. Um, to be honest, she's a typical Novus Ordo Catholic who's at least understands abortion's wrong, or she didn't do a great vote on the Idaho case, but she at least voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. But beyond that, she just wants to be loved by the liberal establishment, and I think she's enamored since she moved to Washington with Washington society. So she wants to show how she gets along with. She's buddy buddy with the three screaming women on the left. So good news, potentially, and may see a lot of these cases wind down.
Yeah, and for our audience, what you heard right there is the exact reason why you need to click a like on this video and share this content, because you're not going to hear that legal analysis anywhere. If you go to MSNBC, they're actually saying that the president is above the law. They're repeating Joe Biden's false opinion. And even if you go on Fox News, they're even confused about this. I genuinely don't think they read the opinion. Now, something that I'd like to briefly mention is just the political ramifications of this. I think that this would have made a bigger splash. It would have been a much bigger of a deal if this happened 2 weeks ago before the debate. Now that the debate has happened, this isn't as big of a deal as it would be, precisely because it's almost certain that Trump is going to win now. Ever since
Yeah.
the debate, it would seem, even from mainstream pollsters like Nate Silver with 538, you see there's something like a 75% chance, when we're talking, statistic wise, not even like looking at polls, that Trump will win. You can also just look at the polling itself. Trump is up double digits in states that they couldn't even think he could win before. And one of the big reasons for that, we talked about last show, that this seemed almost a setup, the last debate, to get Biden to step down. And if there was any sort of plan involved with this, it seems to have gone very poorly. Joe Biden does not seem like he wants to step down. However, the Democratic Party is very divided at this point. There's many governors are trying to meet with Biden in order to see if he is a competent person, if he's even alive. You've got Congress people trying to do the same thing. And it's very likely now that Joe Biden won't be the candidate. And at this rate, the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out, knowing that Kamala Harris is an incredibly unpopular candidate, who is going to replace Biden. And that's a whole nother conversation. They're going to have to deal with the stigma and the different reaction from the radicals on the left, that they won't let a black woman, a woman of color, be the nominee, despite her being the vice president. The Democratic Party is in a big mess. And if I was Trump, I'd be feeling very happy right now. It looks like he will be able to pardon himself, and all of this legal nonsense won't even have to be of a concern. So very positive news for Trump.
Yes, and again, that Biden story is just continually developing. And right, whichever way it goes, either he stays on the ticket, or even if he doesn't, they're just so imploding over it that the infighting will tear the party apart, it seems. I saw the Babylon Bee had a headline that said, Democrats try to convince Biden that he resigned yesterday and forgot about it. Which, but again, these jokes are almost not. You have to wonder, are they real? Because Biden himself came out this week and announced that he, quote, almost fell asleep during the debate. I mean, that was his own words about himself. So when your nominee is kind of admitting that, yeah, it whichever way it goes is pretty sad for them.
Yeah, not looking good for the Democratic
Yeah,
Party. I do think that it's very unlikely he'll actually be the nominee,
yeah,
though, even though they
uh,
are putting out this propaganda. There's
yeah,
just they could do anything, and it'd be a better chance of them winning than
yeah.
putting Biden out there, because the decline was not a one night thing. All of his rallies since, all of his speeches since, have been, even when he's using a teleprompter, he seems incredibly senile, frankly. So they're going to need to do something, and I suspect they will do something.
I again, I think so, but like I always say to people who get so worked up about the evil conspiracies, about, they are evil and malicious, but they're also, we give them a lot more credit for competence. So, many
True.
times they're, and I think COVID in many ways was an example of that. I think whoever was behind or wanted to, it didn't quite work out, I think, the way they hoped, in that there's always unintended, from their perspective, unintended consequences. From our perspective, God's providence of bringing good things out of even evil plans. So never get too discouraged, or, oh, they're so organized, they're so much, because they're often too smart for their own good.
True. Very true.
So speaking about really sad situations, I mentioned the sort of hypocrisy by this that's brought out by this next case. While the Pope's worrying about stopping, a young priest from offering a traditional Latin mass with Mozart music to a bursting congregation of families. Uh, Meanwhile, right under his nose, there's a scandal that's been going on.
Yes, and this story has sort of resurfaced recently, and we'll talk about it because of some comments made by cardinals and bishops that actually seem like they want to do something about this. But this has been a very slow process, and it really does deserve a full overview. So, for our audio listeners, I have on the screen here a short timeline that we'll go over together, just to understand the extent of this and how we got to where we are now. So in 1973, Father Rupnik joined the Jesuits. 1973, and in 1991, and because he was immediately a sort of artistic priest, wanting to get involved in sort of esoteric art things, he in 1991 he finished his thesis on Vyacheslav Ivanov. Now, if you look into that, that's a man very interested in esotericism. He died an Eastern Catholic. However, if you do even like a cursory viewing of some of his writings, some of his works, not good entirely. And I think you could find some of the origins of Rupnik there. And during the same time, he began his guidance from Cardinal Thomas Spidlick, who is another Jesuit. And that's a connection with Benedict XVI, with John Paul II, who made this man a cardinal. There's sources from an interview that this man lived with Rupnik. And this really starts painting a picture that there's a lot involved here. Now, in 1993, the first reports of psychological and sexual violence date back to these years, and the solution that was found in agreement with the bishop of the local diocese was to remove Rupnik from the community. I'm not going to mention what these different reports were because they're too explicit to even mention, but they involve misconduct with nuns, with religious, with young women, over 20 to 40 of them, of psychological abuse, terrible sexual abuse that goes along with that. Awful. Now, in 1999, he's the Vatican superstar. He's making the interior of the Redemptoris Mater Chapel in the Vatican. He ends up making the Padre Pio shrine. He made the Lourdes facade, the John Paul II National Shrine. All of these are done by his mosaics, which are sort of a faux Byzantine mosaic style.
Hmm.
Also in 2009, he was heavily promoted by America Magazine and Father James Martin. I'll have the links to all these things in the description, but it's interesting that you see some crossover there. And the next thing, in 2015, this stuff started coming back to surface, even though the Jesuits managed to keep this under the table in the 90s, doing nothing about this, letting this continue. In 2015, Father Rupnik engaged in major sexual and spiritually manipulative abuse by absolving an Italian novice with whom he had sinned against the sixth commandment. Now, that's an excommunicatable offense that somebody commits. You're not allowed to do that. Obviously, you're not allowed to do that. And it's sad that that happened after the abuse allegations in the 90s. In March 2020, the Vatican approved Rupnik to preach the Lenten homilies, which he did in the Vatican. And in May 2020, he is excommunicated, and then excommunication is lifted that same month, restrictions imposed. The Jesuits had done a small investigation after hearing of that 2015 incident. He was excommunicated, and then mysteriously, the excommunication was lifted. Why wasn't the Society of St. Pius X granted that same thing when Archbishop Lefebvre and the four bishops were excommunicated, so-called excommunicated? We've had the same thing with, we might have an excommunication coming of Vigano. Will he get the same thing? In a month, the excommunication lifted. I highly doubt it. In 2021, a new investigation is opened up simply because they had too many inquiries, and they had 20 to 40 women making these very similar accusations. 2022, the investigation ends. The results were sent to the CDF, and Pope Francis met with Rupnik. An important note here, really didn't make sense for this to go to the CDF. There are different dicasteries for this that would involve disciplinary measures for Rupnik. It's very strange that this went to the CDF. One of the worst parts of this, though, is what came next, which is the next month, even after knowing of all of this, after knowing of these allegations, after the man had been excommunicated, completely convicted, a homily was posted by him from the Diocese of Rome. And the Vatican declared that they will not carry out a canonical process because of the statute of limitations that ended in the 90s, they say. So this happens, again, the thing that's wasn't mentioned in the original reports is, of course, he had this going on even in 2015 with this Italian novice. Now, the final page we have here, December 2022, public reports of this started coming out. This major scandal. Everybody starts becoming outraged at this, rightfully. And immediately we start seeing his honorary degrees being taken away. And the man was put in a shameful light, as he should be. June 15th, 2023, he's expelled from the Jesuits, finally, for disobeying superiors after they had compiled a 150-page dossier involving those 20 to 40 women that were abused. And finally, after constant outrage for all of these years, October 2023, almost a year ago now, keep in mind, think of how quickly the Latin Mass suppression moves. October 2023, Pope Francis finally reopened the investigation. Now, the reason why this has come up is because we've had recently, I have on the screen here, an apologia pro Rupnik. There's been a sort of defense of his artistic works being in these Catholic shrines, these Catholic chapels. Of course, it's very offensive for all of these different people being abused. They have to, their favored shrines, Padre Pio, Lourdes, these are things treasured for the Catholic faith. They have to go there and see their abusers' art. That's very creepy, I'll mind you, very strange looking down on them. One of this started with Ruffini, the prefect of the communications. He said, removing, deleting, and destroying art has never been a good choice. We are not talking about the abuse of minors. We are talking about a story that I don't know. I think this is also something that can be inspiring in terms of being a Christian. And when he questioned, he said, quote, do you think that putting away these photos would make us closer to the victims? The journalist said, yes, of course. And he said, I think you're wrong. So that's the response we've gotten from the Vatican regarding taking down these images. Recently, we've gotten some princes of the church, such as Cardinal O'Malley of Boston, saying that this needs to be taken down. Obviously, he says we must avoid sending a message that the Holy See is oblivious to the psychological distress that so many are suffering. And that's very true. The church has as low credibility as it ever has because of the sexual abuse allegations. And we can't even take down some mosaics that this depraved man put up. Now, the other thing that I will mention is the Bishop of Lords has luckily he's put out a statement saying that this eventually will be taken down, but he says that he's decided to not remove them immediately, given the passions and violence the subject incites. Because, of course, you can get rid of the traditional Latin Mass in a day, but it's much too difficult to take down the mosaics of this depraved man. Doesn't make any sense. Final thing I'll notice, final thing, I suppose. In the You'll find the Angelus magazine, not the Angelus that the SSPX publishes. To be clear, there was a article talking about their article was called "Rupnik Art Dispute More Nuanced Than It Seems." Historian says. If you just do a quick look at that, that historian is Elizabeth Lev. Her only article seems to be talking about, quote, an atheist chapel. So we see all of the different what who these people are really. It's not a matter of this care for art. If they really cared for art, they would care for the traditional Latin Mass. They would not care for this innovative garbage mosaics that are shown around, these new age things plastered on to practically all of our holy sites. I say they need to be taken down. I think it's irresponsible for them to be there. I think there's no comparison for such a man like this, an abuser, to be compared with somebody like the Renaissance artists, for example. I don't think there is a comparison. I think it would be better to take these things down. What do you think about this whole situation, Brian?
Well, definitely, because I mean, having looked at them, they're not even any good. So I
Right.
mean, so they're not, and by good I mean they're not beautiful, because art is art to the extent it conforms to the true, the good, and the beautiful. And these are ugly, frankly. So, regardless of everything else he did, they don't belong in these beautiful places as it is. But I do want to comment on the expulsion by the Jesuits, as you put up there. He was expelled not for these horrific crimes against the Sixth Commandment or committing the excommunicable offense of forgiving a partner in a sin against the Sixth Commandment, but for disobedience to superiors. It reminds me of like when a mafia boss who's, murders, steals, gets goes to jail for mail fraud, right? Because that's the only thing that's all they can get him on. That's kind of what it reminded me of. The Jesuits. Well, I guess this guy's an embarrassment. We have to get rid of him, but let's not actually say what he did. And the utter hypocrisy of Pope Francis, who just seems to want to make this go away, right? All of his words about the people who covered up these things in the past, and now we're not doing it anymore. Is his crocodile tears over it. And every time he can, he closes the investigation, finds a loophole, shuts it down. And I don't believe that excommunication could have been remitted without his approval. There's no way somebody in the Vatican just did that without him knowing about it. So you're right. He's too busy reviewing a decree written by Roach to suppress the Latin Mass than to deal with this situation. So,
Yeah, and the,
sad
the
day.
worst parts I think about this are finding that, knowing that these abuses were going on, even just the 2015
Yeah.
absolution case, he's still made a spiritual guide. He's made
Yes.
giving the Lenten homilies in the Vatican. That's just completely unacceptable. And
Yeah.
when it comes to the art itself, I really think there's something to be said about art is an imitation of nature, but it really is also the imitation of the individual's nature. That
Mm,
used to be that many of these people that were making this beautiful art in the medieval Middle Ages times, they were making this very prayerfully. It was
yes.
connected to their spirituality.
Yes.
The
Yes.
Byzantine icons, all of it's connected with the canons, connected with their spirituality. And to have it completely separated, connected with this man, which many of the people that he has abused allege that it's very connected, his artwork and his different abuses, his awful abuses that he has done. I think there's no reason any of this should be up at these places. These princes of the church need to shut this down as soon as possible, or else face, as Cardinal O'Malley said, extreme hypocrisy.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, before we go, we have a quick breaking story. We reported last time about a letter written by District Superior of the District of France of the SSPX, basically sounding like he was preparing people for the announcement of new bishops, basically making it sound as if it was fairly imminent, saying that bishops are getting old. We need to appoint assistants who will be their successors. And when this happens, there'll be all these accusations, etc. And this led to a lot, not just here, but a lot of places, people speculating, well, this maybe is coming right around the corner. Well, according um, to Corrispondenza Roma, the superior general of the priestly Society of St. Pius X has made a statement in Châteauroux in France, where he was speaking on June 30th. And he denied that this was the case. He denied that there were preparations for an imminent uh, uh, consecration of bishops. And although he says that the consecration of bishops cannot be ruled out a priori, meaning in principle that we can't just say it's not going to happen, it is not currently in the immediate future something that is, quote, on the agenda, right? So it sounds like the person who would make this call, whether it should happen, the Superior General, publicly in a conference denying that this is the case. And again, not that it will never happen, but that it is not in the works right now. So it seems like that story. Again, we don't know the origin of why that letter came out, but it seems like not something to be happening, which probably is a good thing because there's a lot going on this year that in the church right now and in the world. So maybe it wasn't the it wasn't the time for that. So let's put it this way: I don't think we're gonna have trouble finding things to talk about without consecrations happening.
For sure. And people got to pray for this priestly fraternity. They do a lot of good work. And it's going to be a big decision whenever the
Yes.
superiors make that decision. That's going to cause inevitable conflict with Rome. So everybody keep them in your prayers for sure.
It might. I've actually had a weird feeling that if Pope Francis is still around, he might be okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Could be. Could be
stranger
at
things,
this rate.
stranger things
Goodness, who
have happened.
knows?
Yeah, you never know. But well, thank you all for joining us, spending time as we discuss these stories this week. Hope you're enjoying your Fourth of July celebrations wherever you are, and please help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our YouTube, Rumble, or a favorite audio podcast channel such as Spotify. Doing these little things like liking, subscribing, forwarding, commenting, that all helps promote our content so that other people get to find it, as well as subscribing to our monthly newspaper, Catholic Family News. The July issue was just published this week, and you can find content and analysis similar to and in greater depth to that you've come to find on our video channel. So, with that, let us pray, and particularly for our country, this anniversary of its birth, to pray that God's blessings will be poured upon us, that we could someday go back to the origin of this new world, discovered for Catholic powers of Europe, and this we could become someday a Catholic country. They say that seems impossible. How could America become a Catholic state? Well, the Roman Empire did it from 12 men turned the Roman Empire into a Catholic state. So anything is possible. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Eternal Father, offer the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ and all the instruments of his holy passion, that thou may put division in the camp of thy enemy. For as thy beloved Son has said, a kingdom divided against itself shall fall. Our Lady of Fatima.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Great. Well, thank you again, and look forward to visiting again next week.
God bless.